Hello, and welcome to our first show, Stress-Free IEP with Shefter Law PA. I am so excited to start this whole journey with you all and starting these Facebook Lives. And I've really taken a lot of time and energy trying to find the right people to share information with you all to help educate you and empower you as families to have the knowledge you need to walk into an IEP meeting. So today I have a very special guest, Dr. Randi Brown, who is a neuropsychologist based in school system in New York. Welcome, Randi.
Thank you very much for having me, Francie.
We are happy to have you. So tell us a little bit about you, your background, what you do.
Sure. I am a school neuropsychologist. I was a school psychologist with that title for about 25 years. I'm based in New York, and I am an active school psychologist working in a school district in Westchester County, New York. In 2016, I went for some additional training in school neuropsychology. And after finishing that program, I earned my diploma in from the American Board of School Neuropsychologists. So while in school districts, we have school psychologists, I happen to be a school neuropsychologist. And I use my expertise in helping diagnose learning disabilities, other neurological issues in children. Excuse me. I have experience working with kids from the early intervention stage through college level over my career. And most recently, I've taken on my role in my school district as working kindergarten through 12th graders. I am the district-wide evaluator. So that means I am in all buildings, all grades, and I could see a 5-year-old at 10 o'clock, and at 1 o'clock, I could see a 15-year-old. So I know a lot about development. I know a lot about assessment. And I know that one of the most important things in my practice is to ensure that parents understand what I write. They understand what results mean, the content of my report, how it might pertain to how their child learns, different learning profiles, etc. So thank you for finding me and for bringing me to your show so that I could help your parents and any parents out there that really want an explanation of what some of these scores mean, etc.
Thank you. And there's the special little word that why I chose you is the neuropsychologist.
Yes.
Because I get all of the time parents that come in and like, well, I want a neuropsychological evaluation. Why won't the school do it? That's what I want.
Right.
And I don't fully know the difference between a neuropsychological and a regular psychological. What's the difference?
Okay. Well, in school districts across the country, there are school psychologists. They are the ones that are in the schools, and they do psychological evaluations. So when a child is referred for a testing of any kind, for whatever reason, the school psychologist administers at least an IQ test. So that's what we do. And depending on the referral problem, we'll pull in other pieces. We'll do rating questionnaires for, let's say, attention. For executive functioning, we have something like that. We do something called projective testing. So if we're looking at emotional issues in children, we'll do all kinds of, depending on the tools every school psychologist has access to in their school district, they might pull on one of those or a couple of those to assess where a child is emotionally. But that's basically a school psychological evaluation. A neuropsychological evaluation is like, let's just say taking a psychological and taking it deeper. So school districts, if you ask a school district for a neuropsych, chances are they're going to say they don't do it because they don't have school neuropsychologists on staff. A school psychologist is a required member of a school district, but not school neuropsychologists. So you're often going to have to find those kind of evaluations outside of the school district. And a neuropsychological evaluation is doing all the components that I said, but based upon, it's like starting at an entry level. So I'll look at a child's IQ and I'll look at rating scales and things. And if I see there's a weakness, I find something, different kinds of tests that are not normally administered in a school district, and I'll administer those to dig deeper. It's not just does a child have a learning disability, but kind of where in the child's learning profile and in their brain is there a certain part of something that's going on. For example, I've done some neuropsych stuff, and I've had some kids have some vision issues. And through testing, we find out that the child needed glasses, and it was never an issue or never thought that way. So what might have been a visual motor issue ended up being that once the child's prescription was, a new prescription came and they got that, it seemed to make things better. Other things come out of neuropsych things. It's like taking, it's like going into more detail about things. But in terms of school districts and school evaluations, school psychologicals or the psychological evaluation is what they'll do, is what a school district will do, and most times, that's pretty much all you need in terms of looking if you need documentation and stuff for classification.
So then the psychological is all you really need for school services, but a neuropsychological might be something if you want to go into further deeper and see if outside services are needed.
Yes, that's a piece of it too, but it also, if a psychological is done, in some districts, the psychologist does the educational piece as well. In others, they just do the IQ parts and anything related that way, and then they'll have a different team member do the educational. Remember, testing goes on throughout the United States, but every school district, every state may do it differently. So whoever does the academic piece, let's say the child's reading scores are a little low. Well, is that enough to see what's going on with the child, or do you need to do something more? And it's usually a parent's choice whether to pursue that kind of piece of it. But the school district can say, I did this part of the evaluation, and these are the results that we have, and we found a weakness. They don't necessarily have to find out why there's a weakness. That would be more of parental preference and searching that out.
Understood. So, got it. Information needed. So the scores are crazy. And I know going into meetings, parents are always like, what is this? What do you mean my child is 26% or first grade level? What do all these scores mean? Can you explain it to us in layman's terms?
Yes, absolutely. And that's not going to be an issue. Let me just explain what a standardized test is, because I think it's important that parents understand why there's certain tests that are given. When we look at what's called a standardized test, and I'm just going to throw out a couple of acronyms because I assume if our parents are watching, they know what they are. The Wechsler tests, the WISC-5, which is the Wechsler Individual Scale for Children, the 5th edition. Educational testing, the Wyatt, which is the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. There's the Stanford-Binet, which is an IQ test. There's the KTEA, which is an educational test. What all of these have in common is that they're called standardized assessments. And that's why school districts and professionals use standardized assessments in determining if there's a learning disability or not. When a test is standardized, and it means that it has been researched, given out to thousands of children across the country and across any type of socioeconomic factor that you can think of. And what the point of doing that is so that they can come up with, for lack of a better way of saying it, an average for that particular age. So that that I'm in New York, and if I give a child a WISC, which is the IQ test, and that child has a score of 100, and then there's a child in Wyoming, and the school psychologist in Wyoming gives a WISC, and they have a child that has an IQ of 100. Standardized tests mean that I'm administering that test the same way that psychologist in Wyoming is doing it, and Florida, and Utah, and California, and Maine. There's a manual, meaning it's a standardized test. We all follow a manual. We ask the same question, the same exact way, in the same order. We give everything is, as I said, standardized. So it doesn't matter who is administering the test in whatever state it is. It's given the same way in different places. So that's helpful to know that when a test is developed and it's on the market, it has already been researched by the testing companies that produce these tests, and that they've been vetted, they have been sampled with so many different children in so many different places, and then and across the country, like they'll have an Eastern sample, a Midwestern sample, a Western sample, and then they compare all of these scores. I don't get involved with that kind of statistics, but when the manual comes out, it really has all of the scores and measures for that particular age for that child. So that's where we know. So if a child is in New York and they have an IQ of 100 and the family moves to Wyoming and the school psychologist looks at the eval and sees that I gave a whisk, they'll know that I gave it a certain way because that's how they would give it. And that means the IQ is 100 on that testing day. Does that make sense?
That does
help?
totally make sense. But
Right.
then we come, and I know they use the bell curve a lot. I remember
Yes.
that from
Yep.
school.
Yep.
But I know it's confusing for parents a lot of times because, again, you get these percentages, you get this grade level, standard score, scaled score. What is all this difference?
Okay, so I have a visual for us that we can share on the screen, and it is a copy of the bell curve. And what I'm going to explain to you and to all our families is what a bell curve is. Now, remember when I just said a test is standardized and we come up with all these scores for children and different things? The scores for children fall along a bell-shaped curve. And what that basically means is that it gives you an idea of what they call the distribution of the scores across the population. So if you look at the biggest part on that visual where it says average, 50% of the population has an IQ, and we're just looking at IQ for this purpose. Thank you for the arrow. Between 90 and it's really 109. It's 110 starts the next level. So 50% of the population has an IQ between 90 and 109. So if you have a score anywhere in there, your child's functioning in the average range. If you go to, I'm a left-right thing. So if you go to the high average range, so nope, 2 over, high average. Yep. You can notice that part of the bell curve is a little smaller. So that 16.1% of the population falls within, with their full IQ, let's say, would be between 110 and 119. Conversely, on the low average side, you'd have 80 to 89. And as you can see, it thins out. So you don't expect to have most of the population with a deficient IQ or a superior IQ. Even on the low end and the high end, most of the kids that we work with will fall in the average range, the high average range, perhaps the low average range. So that's kind of the distribution of scores of what we see across ages and across kids growing up. If I were to give an adult IQ test, it would be the same bell-shaped curve. But it's a way for us to really get a visual of understanding where IQ scores fall in our population.
So that explains the basic number, but then looking down at percentile rank, because I know I've had parents go, oh, 26%. What does that mean?
Right. So what? Perfect. So why don't we go across, and then we'll talk about what I know you had addressed with me before, grade equivalence and age equivalence. We'll do that. They're not on the graph for a specific reason, because those aren't great statistics, but I will mention those in a minute. Okay. So you're reading your child's report and they say your child has a standard score. A standard score is pretty much a way of, it's a statistic that basically describes where your child's performance fell. And for most tests, they range in a 3-month range, like 5 years old to 5 years, 3 months, 4 months old to 7 months, 8, and et cetera, et cetera. I might have gotten those numbers wrong just off the top of my head, but I'm trying to illustrate it's like a 3-month range. So if a child has a standard score on a WIAD of, let's say, 88 on a subtest, they'd fall in the low average range. If they have a standard score of 113, then they fall in the high average range. What I would recommend to parents is that if you receive a report from a school district that only has numbers, whether it's a standard score, a scale score, a T-score, a percentile rank, whatever it is, ask for what I call the classification. And the classification are those words right above under score type. So that will help you know where your child's performance was. So as I said, if a child got an 88 on a standard score, the next column should say low average. So you kind of know where their score falls in the continuum. So scales, as you can see, a standard score is like 90 to 109. So it's really in that ballpark. Let's drop down a row to a scaled score. Now, the IQ tests usually use scaled scores. The achievement ones usually use standard scores. But as you can see, if a child has a scaled score, like on the coding subtest or vocabulary or any of those, where their scaled score is from 8 to 11, that's the average range. If they have a scaled score of 12 or 13, they're in the high average range. Really having an understanding of what classification the scores fall in will absolutely help you learn how to interpret where your child performs compared to same-aged peers. So I think that's very important. So whether it's a standard score or a scaled score, you can kind of see on this continuum, if a child unfortunately gets a scaled score of 2, well, we know there's a very big problem there. There's a deficient score, and that might be something where I might say, well, you know what, maybe we need to look into that a little further, because what is so deficient on that performance? So that's basically the scaled score. T-scores are a whole nother statistic. But some scores, for example, if you're ever given a Conners rating scale, for example, to determine whether or not your child is exhibiting forms of ADHD, and it's ranked on what's called a Likert scale. So you know how you circle 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, and you have to circle whether your child exhibits, it might say my child is restless, and you rank it. You rank their performance. Well, not at all, a little bit, a lot, or very much. Then you rate it. You circle it. 0, 1, 2, or 3. You rate that statement, and then what happens after that is the clinician scores it, and then the raw score, the tally of whatever comes up with, is correlated with a T-score. So a T-score, again, another statistic to describe where a score falls. But if a child has a T-score of, let's say, 52, that, for whatever category, that would be the average range. If you see T-scores, like on the Conners, if a child gets a T-score of 60 or above, equal to 60 or above, it usually means that there's something significant to look at. It doesn't diagnose ADHD, but it says there's something significant there. So the higher the T-score, essentially, at least if we're looking at ADHD, is more significant. And conversely, I don't really see a lot of numbers in the deficient range or the low range for the most part, but essentially on a scale of ADHD, it might suggest that there's just absolutely no indication at all that there's any kind of issue. So that would be the T-score. Is this okay so far, Francie?
Definitely understood, but it's just funny because I'm looking and thinking about it. I'm like, okay, so standard score and scaled score, the higher numbers are good.
Yes.
Or average and higher achieving, but on the T-score, the higher numbers indicate there's an issue. So it's the opposite.
Right. Well, just because a child's, yes, I see what you're saying. So if a child's IQ is 76 or something, that means there's an issue. But on the T-score, if there's a higher score, it basically means there's something significant. Correct.
That needs to be addressed.
Yes. Now, my most favorite statistic to describe and to put into terms that parents understand is the percentile rank, because I have been on the receiving end for so long of, oh my goodness, my child has a 27%. He is only his score falls at the 27th percentile. That has to be so low. In reality, it's average. Now, if you take into consider my bell-shaped curve, there's a huge range of percentiles. A percentile of 25 or 25% is equal to a standard score of 90. 90 is average. If your child has a percentile of 30, it's solidly in the average range. Child has a percentile or whatever statistic they're explaining of 72, it's still average. It doesn't mean that they are that much over the mark of 50%. So it's a huge range. So when parents see percentiles of 26 or 32 or something like that, understandably, without understanding, it's of concern. But if you can keep in mind this whole bell-shaped curve, the whole distribution, it will show you that if your child has a percentile of 26, they're actually doing okay. There's really nothing to fight over. It's just the child is doing where they should be for their age and everything is that moment in time. Keep also in mind that testing is a snapshot. It's just a snapshot of how that child does that day, on that particular day, on that particular time. And there's so many variables that can affect a child's performance, whether it's before they even get tested or, during the testing session itself.
Right. I'm not a fan of standardized scores, and I tell everybody that, but we have to have something to use. So it's the best we have at this point.
You mean,
But this
I'm sorry, did you mean percentile ranks you're not fond of, or standard scores?
Standardized tests in general.
Oh, okay.
Because, you're having an off day and it can skew everything. Or you guess really well, which I know there's things built in to prevent that, but still, it's just not always accurate.
Exactly. And that's also another key. If you're looking to look at a child and whether or not they have a disability or whether or not there's something really going on, you can't ever, or I don't ever recommend that you only look at one source of information. We look at the whole child, and that's our job as committees on special education. We need to look at the whole child. So that means whether it's psychologically, academically, medically, is the child in good health? Are there any issues that need to be addressed? Emotionally, how's the child doing in the classroom? We should have a classroom observation of that child in the classroom, both during a structured time and during an unstructured time, because there's a whole big difference in that category. In structured times, teachers run the show. We're just looking to see if a child can follow directions. Unstructured, such as lunch, recess, the kids are self-directed. We can really get a lot. I feel we get more information from the unstructured settings when I do those kind of observations than I do in a structured setting. So we just look at so many different components. And of course, there's parent input, teacher input. I mean, there's just so many pieces. Older kids, we look at the report cards, in terms of grades. Younger ones, report cards are more, they're given twice a year in most cases. So you just rely more on what the teacher says in terms of their present levels of performance. But that's a key. We want to look at a child's present levels of performance when we're looking at diagnosing and determining if there's eligibility.
I like that, the observations, to make sure or request that the school do an observation in unstructured time, because 9 times out of 10, the observations are during, math, during reading, during writing, because we want to see how they're doing with that. But a whole different picture when it's during recess or lunch.
Right. You get to see the social skills. You get to see how they negotiate. You get to see how they interact with adults who might be directing them to do something. Again, as you just noted, you can sit and watch a child follow through in a classroom, but I think a structured interview is key also for children that might have ADHD, because you want to kind of get a look to see if a child might, they can follow the direction, but can they sustain it? Or are they looking out the window? Or did somebody squeak their chair and they turn around to that? You can kind of see if there are environmental things that affect children that way too. But I think it should be all all encompassing. I think having both pieces of it would be a good idea.
Right, which makes sense because, and then a child on the spectrum, you need to see in a social setting. Right. It's going to be a very different picture.
Yes.
So the bell curve, you can just take that to any standardized test and have that in front of you to help, a parent could do that to help them see where things fall if the school psychologist isn't as fabulous as you and doesn't put all those scores in there.
Thank you. Yes, but that, if you get a report from a school district, I wouldn't see anything wrong with emailing, it's not a big deal, but you can email the school psychologist maybe and just say, can you please just give me an idea of where each of these scores fall? In what range? What are they classified as? And any school psychologist should do that. They should know how to do that. And if they don't know off the top of their head, the manual tells them.
Understood.
So I use it all the time in my reports because it's just so much easier. And actually, I'll tell you truthfully, the only things I report in terms of my testing. So if I'm doing an IQ test, I report the IQ scores, and the WISC uses, and that's the one I use mostly up here. And again, I'm in New York, but it comes up with scaled scores. So I'll note the subtest and the scaled score and the classification. I don't note any other statistic. I don't list percentiles, again, because I've learned that there's so many questions about them. And when I review the test results, if a parent asks me about percentiles, I'll explain my whole bell curve and, how a 26 is solidly in the, it's in the average range, the lower end of average, but it's still average. I don't report that. And then let's talk about the two statistics where we don't like to, I don't, use or
I, for a while, didn't realize that grade equivalent isn't really grade equivalent and shouldn't be used, because in a lot of meetings I've been to, it's used so often.
Yes. I'm going to tell you it's probably, in my opinion, the worst statistic that's out there. And I'm going to tell you why. Grade equivalent is so broad and so general, meaning there are lots of times you might have a second grader and you have kids in there that are 7, so they might be 8, and they might be 6. So I'm going to put a scenario, Francie, in front of you, okay? I have a child, let's say there's a child in the grade that's born January 2nd, 2020. Okay, let's just say they're born January 2nd, 2020. And obviously they can't be in second grade, but let's just say we have someone born, someone in the grade that's January, okay? Someone in the same grade could have a birthday May 2021. Well, that's a huge difference, but they're in the same grade. So you take the child that's 17 months ahead with 17 months more of learning experience, 17 months more of formal education versus that other one, they're in the same grade. How can that be statistically appropriate? Right? I mean, there could be a 24-month difference, a maximum of, let's just say, 24 months between of children in a grade. They could be January 2020 and December 2021. That's 24 months of difference in the same grade. So how can that be equal?
Got it. So it's still saying, so they would say second grade level, but second grade level of which age group?
That's what I'm
saying.
Interesting. And I know I totally used the wrong thing, because how could you have 2020 and 2021? But I was trying to
basically right. It's the same idea, but it makes sense, because it's like, again, you have a 6-year-old, you have an 8-year-old in the same grade. That doesn't work. So grade levels are out. Ignore it. I should tell families, just if a school reports it, just black that part out. You don't even need to look at it.
How many, a lot of times children take an extra year before they enter kindergarten. So they're actually entering kindergarten at the age of 6 instead of typically, depending where in the country, but 5 years old. If you have a late birthday and you're on time, like my birthday's October. I started kindergarten when I was 4 years and 11 months, because I turned 5 in October. So, if I'm 4 years, 11 months in kindergarten, and I have a child, a peer that was left, that took an extra year and started when they were almost 6, I'm 4 years old, 11 months, and they're 6 years old. I mean, just even developmentally, think of the brain differences, think of the cognitive differences in children in that range. Grade equivalent, it's just a statistic that I put no credence in. Personally, I'm not speaking about, if any other professional feels differently, that's okay. I'm just saying, for me, I don't look at grade equivalents. I never do. And I've done trainings with different staff members and different districts and stuff on statistics. And I do the same thing. I've taught graduate classes at the college level for upcoming educators that are going to be giving and administering tests. And I also, in those classes, I explain about the grade equivalent and why it's probably not a statistic they kind of want to use. So that's that.
Understood. And it doesn't, I mean, the question I get a lot, like, I'll have a ninth grader that's being evaluated for the first time for whatever reason, or being evaluated again for a reevaluation, and it'll come up that they're reading on a second grade level. Is that like it?
I would say, what's the standard score? What's the scaled score if the test used a scale score? I don't see how that's possible. And I would understand how a parent would surely get very, very nervous about that. What's going on here? And that's another reason why I wouldn't use grade equivalent. I would look at the standard score or the scaled score to see where they fall in the classification as well. And now that you have the bell-shaped curve to look at, to use as a guide, you can kind of see where your child's reading is at that point. I wouldn't pay attention to grade equivalent. You know what? Even if you don't have that, ask what the percentile is. Now that you know 25 to 74 is the average range, you can kind of gauge if it's really low or on the other end. So
That makes sense.
yeah.
And then is that the same with age equivalent?
Age equivalent is also a statistic that I am not fond of, but it's better than grade equivalent. It's when tests are standardized, et cetera, scores are usually broken down in the manual. Like if we look up a child's raw score, we tally how they did on that subtest, and we're correlating it to how they did. It's usually a 3-month range, like 0 days to 5 years, 3 months, 30 days. So we would look up the raw score, and if depending on the test, their scaled score would come up to be a certain number. It's an age equivalent. It's also not the best statistic because it's not what they standardize the tests on. They standardize the tests and use standard scores, the scaled scores. Those are the ones, if you want your most accurate reading on how a child performs, you're going to get it from there. I mean, an age equivalent could be something as, like you just described, something as low as, a 3-year-old reading. Are you really going to say the child is reading at a 3-year-old level when they might be in the low average range? So there's a big difference between reading it as a 3-year-old, which is like a preschooler, which probably isn't reading,
Right.
and then you have maybe a low average score, which is a standard score that falls in the low average range. I'd have to see, something specific like that, but my recommendation is to not look at those two statistics because they're weak and there's really not a lot to hold up on. If you went to a school district and you said, my child is reading at the 6-year-old level, but they have a standard score of 85, they're going to say that's not true. It's just statistically what that score might be equal to. Your child is actually reading in the low average range because 85 standard score is in the low average range. So
that makes sense.
Yeah,
I'm looking at it, I'm thinking back of like how many times, myself included, when my daughter was evaluated, that I go into panic mode, seeing some of these scores. Why do they do that to us? Like, just because clearly the way you explained it, coming up as an age or a grade doesn't matter if you're falling in the average range.
Exactly. You want to see where the child is performing, on a standardized assessment, which means if you have a 7-year-old, you want to make sure they're performing just as well as a 7-year-old across all the states. That's really what you want. You want to see where those scores fall. And as such, you would look at the standard score or the scaled score.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for explaining all these numbers to make sense.
You're welcome. I hope it was helpful. I hope I explained it in terms that make it easy, for parents moving forward to kind of understand, at least in the beginning, of what the report says. I'd also suggest that parents read don't just jump to the score. Read the report. Read the behavioral observation part. I always take time to write. I take the time to write out how a child does because the behavioral observation is, how is that child behaving during the evaluation? So that's what the clinician is actually reporting. How is the child doing at that point in time? So, are they friendly? Are they withdrawn? Do they seem interested? Do they seem not interested? A whole lot of it is motivation, not motivated, spontaneous conversation. I've had kids that are so chatty, I have to say, we have to get back to what we're doing. And they might interact with me in between when I switch subtests and stuff. And I've got other kids that will only speak when spoken to. They'll give you the shortest responses. Those are two very different observations and can both greatly affect test scores.
I was just going to say, thinking about that, thank you for pointing that out because I've never really thought about that.
Right.
But as a tester, you haven't really seen that child that often. You don't know if that's normal behavior or not. As the
Absolutely.
parents of the teachers, we can say, wait a minute, my child was shy and wasn't interacting.
Right.
That was an off day. Like, this is not my child.
And it's so important. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. In my district, I'm given a name and a grade and the teacher to coordinate the testing with. So I don't know the kids usually before I test them. I do after, but I don't know them before. And actually, as an evaluator and over the course of time and with the quantity of evaluations I've done, I prefer that. I don't want anybody giving me any sort of rose-colored glasses or any kind of glasses where I'm going to see the child through their eyes. I want to see the child through my eyes. I want to see how they do, how they perform, how they interact with me. And that gives me a very clear idea of whether I feel how the child performs is an accurate representation. Like, are the scores representative of how that child acted during that particular session?
And that makes so much sense because, as you said at the beginning, going back full circle is you need to look at the whole child.
Right.
Look at the standard scores, look at the tests, look at the observations, look at everything before looking at and determining what the child needs.
Yeah. There's so much that goes into it. I mean, from a clinician's point of view, there's a lot that goes into testing. Please know that when a clinician writes a report, psychologist, special educator, speech therapist, OT, PT, there's a lot of effort and a lot of time that goes into providing these written documents, these reports. It starts from when we get the child's name, and it's the whole testing session, and it's interpreting the results and what do we feel as clinicians, how do these numbers fall out, and is there, we need to find ways to express it in writing, because we need to make sure what we see is accurately written in writing. So I don't want any parent to think, oh, they only took 5 minutes to do that and that's what the results are. No. Even the administration of these tests, depending on the child and their cooperativeness and everything, it can run a standard length of time and it can run over. There's one thing I just want to also point out, and I just thought of it off the top of my head. When children, if children that are already classified or they already have an IEP, if they are retested, because every 3 years, the laws, at least in New York, I assume, Francie, in Maryland, it's the same.
It's federal
law. Every 3 years, a child must be reevaluated. Now, reevaluation can take the form of many different things, but in the sake of my discussion, if a child is reevaluated, it's important to know that the testing happens without any test accommodations and no program modifications. They are tested as any other child. They are not given extra time, directions explained. If that's not in the manual, then it doesn't happen. All these things. And there's a very good reason why. Because we need to see if the child needs those things.
Right.
If we give the testing with accommodations, everyone's going to come out fine and kids will be declassified left and right. The point is to test a child without anything that's on their IEP so that the evaluator says, wow, okay. Like, I've had some kids that, absolutely have taken so much time on an IQ test that might, take another child 45 minutes. We're working on an hour and 20 minutes and the child just finishes. And I'm like, yeah, they still need their extra time, because that's what they need. But if I gave that child time and a half, there'd be no disability.
Right.
No substantiation for the continuation of the IEP. So please know that when your child is tested, it is done in, I'll call it raw conditions. Just take the kid out of the classroom and just work with the child. No IEP, no nothing.
That's
important to know.
Because how else would you know that they need the services or not?
Exactly. Because when they were first tested and when they were first eligible, that's how you knew they needed services in the first place. Right? Because, if you have a new referral, the kids are just tested. There's no IEP to even reflect off of.
Interesting.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I haven't even thought about that. And that's a whole nother topic. We could
that's a
probably
whole
do a
other
whole show
topic.
on reevaluations and
Right,
where,
right,
where to go. Because here, a lot of times schools will be like, oh, he's still eligible. We don't need to test, do we? And the parents not knowing any better say, yeah, no, that's fine. And the kids
right.
go on, which don't even get me started on that one.
Yeah,
We'll have
okay.
to schedule another show.
Right,
Talk about
exactly.
that. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, my
How can
pleasure.
how can people get in touch with you if people want to reach out and get in touch with you?
Sure. I have my own consulting and coaching business. There's my information right on the screen. I am the owner of Comprehensive Academic Coaching Solutions. My contact, my phone number, 914-200-4744. My website, www.cacsnow, that's NOW.com. And my email is the same website, but just Dr. Randi at cacsnow.com.
That is awesome. And just for clarification, because now with COVID, everybody's Zoom, are
Yes.
you only seeing people in New York or can you see people nationwide?
Interesting. Before the pandemic, I was seeing people nationwide. I've had clients in Maryland. I've had clients in Florida. I've had, word gets out, and I just, I work with families that way. I do a lot of coaching, like if I do a lot of consulting, executive functioning skills, study skills, things like that. And it's actually a niche that I found from all my testing, because there were so many kids that needed some kind of strategies and some kind of implementation. Time management, a huge issue. I mean, it's one of the main things that I help with. An organization. I teach kids how to manage their time. I teach kids study strategies. Sometimes parents will ask me to read a report. I'll read it, and I can think of fun ways to build up, let's say, a skill that maybe was deficient or poor on an IQ test. Let's say like their visual perceptual ability, not their vision, but what is their brain doing with the information coming in through this sense. So if they score low on that, I can come up, depending on the age level, with strategies, fun strategies, not academic, but things like that to help build those abilities without the child even knowing it.
Which is key because
Which is
nobody wants
key.
to do more school, more studying.
Exactly. Kids are more apt to do fun things than they are to, take out a workbook and, do
Yep.
some extra math problems or something. I mean, if that's something that needs help, you have to do that. But for some other issues and other skills and stuff, there are fun ways to go about doing it without even,
And you can
knowing
kind
what
of
you're doing.
sneak them in, after
Absolutely.
this, we do that.
Absolutely.
Different activities.
Absolutely.
This has been wonderful, amazing. Thank you so much. I am so excited because if this is our first event, my first event doing this, I can just see where we're going to go in the future.
Thank you.
And
Thank
hopefully,
you.
maybe in the future, we'll have you on again to hit some of the other areas that I know we have lots of issues with around here.
Absolutely. And if they write in the comment line, if there's a topic that you want me to cover, I'm more than happy to do that, coordinate with Francie, and then I can come up with, some more guest appearances on your show. So that would be fantastic.
Yeah, that's a great idea. If anybody wants to comment with some ideas of who they like to talk to or topics that you'd like Randi to cover, that would be great. And her information and my information will be in the show notes. And hopefully you all will tune in again soon with Shefter Law PA, where we help families have a stress-free IEP experience.